The phantom explosion of Magdalene and Quixada. I was never a person who believed in haunting stories or anything that ran out of the normal. I grew up in Madalena, a small and quiet town where the most exciting things that happened were the patron saints' parties or the stories that the elders told to scare us. But what happened that day in 1958 completely changed my way of seeing the world. I was 14 years old and remember it as if it were yesterday. It was a hot afternoon, one where the heat seems to stick to the skin, and I was sitting on the porch of my house, trying to find some shade. Everything seemed normal until the sky began to change color, becoming a strange reddish shade, as if the sun was dying on the horizon before time. The noise came from nowhere. A bang so strong that made the floor shake and the glasses in the kitchen fall to the ground, breaking into 1,000 pieces. I ran inside, thinking it was some lightning or plane explosion, something I barely knew what it was like, but that seemed to make sense at the time. The sound seemed to prolong, as if it was not only an impact, but something that vibrated in the air, leaving a pressure in the ears that made the head hurt. When I looked out the window, I saw the flash in the sky, bright and pulsating, and a column of smoke rising in the distance. My father, who was a practical man and little given to superstitions, took the hat and said we would go there to see what had happened. My mother begged us to stay, saying it didn't seem like something from God. Today, I think she was right. As we walked towards the spot of the flash, I realized that the silence was almost absolute, something I only noticed because we usually heard the sounds of nature, the wind in the dry branches, the singing of birds. But at that moment, everything seemed frozen. Even the insects, which were always buzzing around, were quiet. My father, usually full of opinion about everything, also did not say a word the whole way. The closer we got, the more the air became heavy, as if we were entering a place that was not made for humans. There was a strange smell in the air, something that mixed burnt with iron, a smell that seemed to stick to the throat. Don't know if it was fear or curiosity, but I kept walking, even with my legs shaking. When we arrived at an open field, we saw that other people from the city had also come. Everyone stood still, looking at what I can only describe as impossible. In the middle of the field, where there should be dry land, there was a huge crater, but it did not look like just a hole. The rim shone with an orange tone, as if it was melted, and a dense black smoke slowly rose up, forming spirals that did not dissipate with the wind. It was then that I started to listen. At first I thought it was my imagination, but it wasn't. There was a sound coming from the smoke, low and continuous, like whispers in a language I did not understand. Some people approached, but with each step taken, the stronger was the feeling that something there was looking back. That's when I saw the first one. In the smoke, something moved. It wasn't human, but it had a shape that could be confused from afar. It seemed to be made of shadows, as if the very dark had come to life. I wanted to shout, warn my father, but my voice just didn't leave. Other people started noticing too, and it was chaos. Someone shouted that it was the devil's thing, and a woman fainted at the same instant. My father held me by the arm and tried to pull me back, but I was hypnotized. It was as if the thing in the smoke was calling, pulling me without touching. And then something happened that still torments me. The shadows began to come out of the crater, moving like a slow but deliberate wave, spreading towards us. People started running, but it was like running away from something that was already in their mind. The further we went, the more it seemed that the whispering sound became louder, closer. My father dragged me to a part of the bush farther away, and that's when we saw one of the men who were closest to the crater fall on his knees. He was screaming, but the sound sounded muffled, as if submerged. Suddenly he was quiet, as if something had sucked all his energy. Then he just fell forward still. Whatever was in the smoke seemed to be feeding on him. My father pushed me hard, telling me to run and not look back. And I obeyed. Running through the dry bush, I felt my heart almost go out of my mouth. The sound of whispers continued even as the distance increased. It was like it was inside my head. Some people passed us, others just stood behind, as if they were frozen in fear or unable to understand what was happening. When we finally got close to the first houses, my mother was already there, looking at the horizon with her hands together, praying. The whole city seemed in shock, with children crying and adults looking up at the sky as if they were expecting something worse. But the strangest thing was that the flash in the sky was still there, beating like a giant and distant heart. There was no way to ignore, there was no way to pretend that it was natural. I thought the thing had stayed in the field, but we soon realized that it had come with us. During the night, several people began to complain of noises outside their houses, as if someone was dragging chains or banging on the wood of the doors. My father went out to see what it was, but came back pale, saying only to close everything and be quiet. That morning, no one slept. I swear I saw shadows moving in the yard, even without any light. When I looked through the window, I saw something standing in the dark, watching me. No eyes, but I knew I was being looked at. The feeling was suffocating, like I was stuck in a nightmare from which I could not wake up. The next morning, things got even stranger. Some people in town just didn't show up anymore. A neighbor who lived 3 houses after ours, Mr. Joaquin, was known for waking up early and taking care of the chickens. But that morning, his yard was empty and the door of the house opened. When my father went to check, he found everything in place except him. No sign of a struggle, no footprints, nothing. It was not the only case. At the end of the day, at least 5 people had disappeared without explanation. Those who were near the crater at the time of the explosion seemed to be the first to disappear, but no one was sure. And what was even more frightening, every house where someone disappeared had dark marks on the walls like burnt stains, but without smell or texture, as if the air itself had marked those walls. Fear took hold of the city. Some families took their things and fled, but my mother insisted that we would stay, that God would protect us. I didn't know if I believed it, but the truth is we had nowhere to go either. That night things got worse. More noises, more whispers, more shadows. It was as if whatever came out of that smoke was surrounding us, playing with us. I remember hearing my mother crying as she prayed, and my father sitting in the corner of the room, holding a machete that seemed useless against what no one could understand. I tried to pretend that I was asleep, but every noise made me open my eyes. The worst moment was when something scraped at the window, slowly, as if trying to get in. I knew it wasn't human. That early morning, something changed. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, silence became absolute again, as in the afternoon of the explosion. Even the crickets and the neighborhood dogs stopped, and a strange cold took over the air, despite the typical heat of the backcountry. That's when we heard a sound that seemed a lament, a distant cry, but that seemed to echo inside our house. My father stood up, and before he could stop us, my mother opened the window to see. Outside, the flash we had seen in the sky seemed lower, closer, as if it had descended to earth. In the middle of that pulsating glow, There were moving shapes, slow, almost human, but distorted. One of them seemed to look directly at our home. I will never forget my mother's face at that moment. She closed the window so fast, the glass almost broke. The rest of the night was a blur. We didn't know what to do but lock ourselves up and wait for it to pass. When the sun finally rose, the flash disappeared, but the city was different. More people had disappeared, and the dark spots were on more walls, including ours. My father tried to wipe them with a wet cloth, but it didn't help. It was like they were part of the wood. That day, a group of men decided to go to the crater to try to understand what was happening. My father went with them, despite my mother's protests. He came back hours later without a word. He just sat on the doorstep and looked at the floor, as if he had seen something his mind could not process. Until today, I never knew what he saw there. After that day, everything seemed to return to normal, at least on the surface. The flash never appeared again, and the noises and shadows ceased. But the marks on the houses remained, as scars of something we can't understand. Some families moved, including Mr. Marquez's. Joaquim, who was still reported missing. Others, like ours, decided to stay, even with fear lurking like a ghost. My father never spoke about what he saw in the crater, and whenever someone touched on the subject, he just shook his head and changed the subject. The city has never been the same, and to this day, stories of the ghost explosion still circulate among older residents. But the strangest thing happened years later, when out of curiosity, I returned to the field where it all began. The crater was no longer there. There was no sign of burnt earth or the molten rim I saw that day. It seemed as if nothing had happened, as if the ground had closed on itself and erased any evidence. What still haunts me, however, are the marks. Recently, when I visited the childhood home that was abandoned after my parents passed away, I saw that they were still there, just as well. No matter what I tried, they never left. Some nights I still dream about those shadows in the smoke, and the sound of the whispers echoes back in my mind, as if it had never really gone away. And to be honest, I don't know if it ever will. The blood pact between Brazil and the United States. I grew up in a small town in the northeast backwoods, one of those where everyone knows everyone else, and life seems to follow its own rhythm. That was in 1959, shortly after an explosion that everyone in the region was still commenting on, although no one knew how to explain what had happened. I was 17 at the time, and my routine was simple. Help my father in the garden during the day, and spend the nights listening to the stories of the elders in the square. My grandfather, in particular, loved to tell about the pact that they said was made between Brazil and the Americans. At the time, I thought all this was just talk of people who read too much newspaper or liked to scare others. But on that particular day, I realized there was something more behind these stories. It was a hot and stuffy night, and I had decided to stay on the balcony after dinner. The sky was clear, with stars shining more than normal, but there was a strange thing in the air that I could not explain. It was as if the silence was heavier, almost palpable. I remember hearing a distant noise, something that sounded like thunder, but didn't match the clear sky. In a matter of minutes, the wind began to blow with force, lifting the dust from the road, and a strange smell invaded the air, a mixture of burnt with something metallic. My father, who was always skeptical about these stories, went out to see what was happening, but came back inside with a serious face, saying only, "Stay here." I should have listened to my father, but the curiosity was stronger. Went out the back door, trying not to make noise, and I went towards the field that was behind home. As I approached, the noise that before seemed distant became clearer, but it was not only thunder. It was an irregular sound like metal being dragged, mixed with something that looked like screams. It was hard to tell, but I could feel in my stomach that it wasn't normal. When I reached the top of a hill, I saw something that made me freeze. In the distance, towards the road leading to the neighboring city, there was a red light that pulsed like an open wound in the middle of darkness. But it was not only that. Around the flash, shadows moved in an unnatural way, too fast, as if they were hungry faces. My heart popped, but for some reason I kept watching. It was when I realized there was something more. The screams I heard were not only from the flash, they came from heaven as well. I know it sounds crazy, but it was as if the air itself was screaming, loaded with pain and despair. I began to feel my body tremble, not of cold, but of pure fear. It was then that I saw one of the figures stand out from the rest. It was bigger and looked more solid, almost human, but wrong. His movements were sudden, and he seemed to be looking for something. When it turned towards me, I knew I had to run. Don't know if he saw me or felt my presence, but the dread took hold of me, and my legs moved on their own, taking me back home as fast as I could. I came home panting, with my chest burning, and slammed the door hard, which made my father come running out of the room. He held me by the shoulders, shaking me, and asked what had happened. I could not answer immediately, still trying to organize the thoughts, but the words simply did not come. It was my mother who first realized that something was wrong out there. She pointed to the window, and we all saw. The flash that was far away seemed closer, and a gigantic shadow moved slowly towards the city. It was as if the whole sky had darkened, despite the bright red light. The wind blew again with more force, and the metallic smell seemed even stronger, almost impossible to bear. My father, who was the kind of man who faced anything with his head held high, was paralyzed for a few seconds, until he took the machete that always kept in the corner of the room. He told us all to go into the room and lock the door, but my mother insisted that he stay with us. While they were arguing, I heard the sound of something dragging on the floor. Outside, it was a slow, repetitive noise with claws passing through the wood of the porch. My father made a signal to be quiet, but the sound became louder, closer, until it suddenly stopped. I could hear my heavy breathing and the sound of my heart beating so loud that it felt like it was coming out of my chest. The silence that followed was even worse, because it was as if something was waiting outside, listening. The tension was unbearable. We stood there in the room, huddled in the corner, with the door locked and my father's machete balanced against the wall. My mother whispered prayers quietly, while I tried not to cry. It was then that we heard the most terrifying sound of my life. It was like a cry, but not human, a guttural sound, deep, that seemed to come from all sides at the same time. The walls vibrated, and the ground seemed to shake slightly. My mother squeezed my hand so hard that it almost hurt me, and I could only think that I didn't want to die there. The scream was followed by loud banging on the front door. 3 beats, each higher than the previous one, as if something colossal was demanding entry. My father raised his machete and made a gesture to be quiet. After the beats, the silence returned, but the feeling that something was there did not go away. The air was dense, heavy, difficult to breathe. Suddenly, we heard footsteps outside the house, slow, dragged, but with a weight that made the boards of the floor creaked. They circled the house, stopping right in front of the window of the room where we were. Despite the closed curtains, The red light from outside illuminated the environment in a disturbing way, creating shadows on the walls that seemed to move by themselves. My father approached the window, trying not to make noise, but before he could take another step, something scratched the glass. The sound was high, like metal against metal, and it was enough to make my mother drop a muffled scream. I wanted to run away, but where? The scratches on the glass stopped as abruptly as they began, but the feeling that something was watching us remained. My father slowly moved away from the window, with his machete still steady in his hands, and gestured to us to get down. I hid behind the bed, feeling the sweat running down my back, while my mother pressed a third against her chest. It was when we heard the sound of something heavy falling on the porch, as if a body had thrown itself from above. My heart popped, and I held my breath, trying not to make the slightest noise. Whatever was out there was moving again, but this time the sound was different, more frantic. It seemed to be scratching the earth around the house, as if looking for something, or trying to get in. Suddenly, a flash illuminated the whole room for a fraction of a second, so strong that blinded us momentarily. It was as if the red glow had exploded in our direction, but at the same time left no trace of heat, just a feeling of deep emptiness. When we opened our eyes, everything was quiet again. There were no more scratches, steps, or strange lights. My father stood up slowly, and against the protests of my mother, went to the front door to see what had happened. Waited with my heart in my mouth until I heard the wood squeal when he opened the door. Outside, the night was completely normal. There was no sign of anything, neither marks on the ground nor flash in the sky. It was as if nothing had happened. My father came back inside still holding the machete, but with a look that I never forgot. It was a mix of confusion and fear, something I had never seen before. He just shook his head and muttered, "There's nothing out there." My mother tried to insist, asking about the sounds, the light, the weight we heard on the porch, but he just repeated the same thing, "There's nothing out there." Despite the words, we knew something had happened. The feeling of emptiness, and that we were being observed, still hovered in the air, like an invisible shadow. We spent the rest of the night awake, with the windows closed and all lights on. It was one of the longest nights of my life, and even with dawn, the feeling of security never fully returned. The next morning, when we finally had the courage to leave, we found something that froze the blood in our veins. In the middle of the porch, there were deep marks on the wooden floor, like claws that had been dragged. There were no footprints, no signs that anything or anyone had passed through there, but the marks were there, as real as the sun rising on the horizon. My father, stubborn as always, did not let anyone in the family comment on what happened with the neighbors. He said that he did not want them to keep making up stories. But until today, every time I remember that night, I ask myself, what was the covenant brought to the Backlands? Whatever it is, I'm sure it's still there, waiting in the darkness for more victims. The invisible curse. I was never a believer in haunted stories or curses, but what happened after the explosion made me rethink everything. I live in a small village in the Backlands, a simple place where everyone knows each other, and any news becomes a subject for weeks. The explosion happened about 10 miles from here, but the impact was felt throughout the region. It was not just the bang, which seemed to shake the ground for hours, but the feeling that came after. Something changed in the air. It was as if the wind had stopped, as if the environment itself was suffocated. At that time, I was 26 and spent the day helping my father in the plantation. Remember that when the sound echoed, He let go of his hoe and looked at the horizon. "That's not a good thing," he said, and I just laughed, thinking it was overkill. But the strange began a few days later. Some people in the village began to complain of a feeling of heaviness, as if they had a bag of stones tied to their backs all the time. My neighbor, Donna Lourdes, a woman of almost 70 years, was the first to complain. She said she felt like she was being followed by something she couldn't see. At first, no one took it seriously, but soon other people started saying the same thing. I felt it too, but tried to ignore it. I thought it was paranoia, that the tension of the explosion had made everyone nervous. But in less than a week, things got worse. Tumors began to appear in some residents, strange blisters on the skin that seemed to grow from one day to the next. Donna Lourdes was the first to get sick, and what I saw in her body was enough to make me believe that something was profoundly wrong. I remember the first time I saw Donna Lourdes after the wounds began to appear. I went to her house with my mother, who wanted to take a herbal tea, thinking it was some common disease of the backlands. But when she opened the door, I could barely hide the shock. Her skin was full of dark spots, almost like burns, and some parts seemed to be corroding, leaving flesh exposed. She cried as she explained that it was not physical pain that tormented her more, but the dreams. "They talk to me," she whispered, grabbing my hand with a force I never imagined an old lady could have. "They say we belong to them now." My mother tried to calm her down, saying it was high fever, delirium, but I knew there was something else. The way her eyes were fixed on some empty spot in the wall made me want to run away from there. On the way home, I commented about the dreams, but my mother told me to shut up. "That's bullshit. Sick people dream bad things," she said. Only that night, I had my first nightmare. I was alone in the field, surrounded by a dense mist that seemed to breathe, pulsating around me. In the midst of that darkness, voices whispered, a mixture of anger and satisfaction, repeating the same phrase, "You are ours now." I woke up in the middle of the morning, sweating and with a strange feeling in my chest, as if something was squeezing me inside. When I looked in the mirror, I noticed something that made me freeze. A small bubble began to form at the base of my neck. It was small, almost imperceptible, but I knew that it was not normal. The next day, I tried to ignore what was happening. I followed my routine, helping my father in the field, but the weight in the air seemed worse every hour. It was as if something invisible was watching us, pressing against our bodies. My father, who rarely complained about anything, commented that he was feeling older than ever, as if his strength were being sucked. In the village, rumors began to grow. More people were with strange wounds, and stories about dreams became common. It seemed that no one wanted to talk about it openly, but the frightened looks said everything. Donna Lourdes, who used to walk around the village every morning, never left home. One of the neighbors swore he heard whispers coming from her house during the night, even when there was no one around. That afternoon, I decided to visit a friend, Joao, who lived a little further away. He was a quiet guy who did not listen to haunting stories. I thought talking to him would help me get those ideas out of my head. But when I arrived, I found his house empty. The door was ajar, and there was a strange smell in the air, like burnt meat mixed with something rotten. I went calling for him, but only found the house in complete silence. What made me freeze was seeing the marks on the floor of the room, as if something had scratched the cement, leaving deep grooves. In the corner, a chair was overturned, and there were dark spots around it, which I could only imagine what they were. It was then that I heard a faint, almost imperceptible sound coming from the room. It sounded like a groan, but at the same time something not human. I slowly walked towards the room, trying not to make noise. Each step seemed to weigh a ton, and the groaning continued, interspersed with something that looked like a whisper, but was too low for me to understand. When I pushed the door, I saw something that I will never forget. Joao was on the floor with his back, skin covered by those same dark bubbles that I saw in Dona Lourdes, but much worse. Some were open, leaking a liquid that smelled so bad that it made me choke. He looked at me, but it was as if he did not recognize me. His eyes were wide, almost out of the sockets, and his mouth trembled as he tried to say something. Then I heard, not from him, but from the room. The voices. They were several, whispering at the same time, in an almost cheerful but cruel tone. "You are ours now." Before he could react, John began to convulse, and I backed away, almost stumbling on the doorstop. That was not a common disease, it could not be. I felt a sharp cold in the air, as if something was approaching, but I could not see. He ran out of the house, without looking back, with a heart beating and a dread that he had never felt before. When I came back to the village, I told what I saw, but nobody wanted to hear me. "Don't go messing with that," they said. That night the whispers started again, but now they were not only in dreams. They were real, coming from outside the house. Closed all the doors and windows, but it did not help. They were there, circling, saying the same thing over and over again. The weight in the air was unbearable, and I began to feel a sharp pain in my neck, right where the bubble had appeared. The neck pain worsened during the night. It was as if something was growing there, a constant pressure that pulsed along with the sound of whispers. I couldn't sleep, so I sat on the floor of my room, holding a small knife that I picked up in the kitchen, as if it was protecting me from something invisible. At one point, I felt a shiver rising up the spine, and that's when I realized the whispers no longer came from outside. They were inside the house. The sound was low, almost imperceptible, but it seemed to echo through the walls, as if the wood itself were alive. I got up slowly and went to the room, trying to understand where it was coming from. When I passed through the door, the air seemed heavier, as if each step was against an invisible wall. And then I saw a shadow standing in the corner, motionless, but that seemed to observe me. It was not a common shadow. It did not come from any light, and did not move as something natural. It was opaque, with irregular edges that seemed to curl like smoke stuck in time. My body froze. I wanted to run, scream, anything, but I couldn't. All I could do was stand still, while the sound of whispers increased as if they came from every corner of the house. The shadow began to move slowly towards me, and I felt a cold so intense that my vision became blurred. Don't know how, but my feet finally reacted, and I ran back to the room, locking the door behind me. But the worst happened. The whispers stopped, and the silence at that moment was more frightening than any sound I have ever heard. It was as if the whole house was holding its breath, waiting. I stayed in the room until dawn, without sleep, without eating, just waiting for it to end. When the sun finally appeared, the weight in the air decreased, and the whispers disappeared. Opened the door carefully and walked through the whole house, but there was nothing left. The shadow had gone, and silence seemed normal again. Still, the fear continued. I took a small mirror to see the neck, and almost vomited at the look. The bubble had burst during the night, leaving an open wound deep, as if something had come out of it. Wrapped a cloth around to hide, but the feeling that it was still there somehow did not abandon me. I decided to leave home that same day and go to church, looking for some protection, anything that would make me feel safe again. When I arrived in the village, I noticed that something was different. Most of the houses were closed with the doors closed, and few people were on the street. The ones I saw looked sick, pale, with empty eyes. When I passed by Dona Lourdes' house, I felt a shiver. The door was open, but the inside was empty, with no sign of her or furniture. It was as if she had never lived there. At the end of that day, I left the village and never came back. To this day, the sound of whispers haunts me in dreams, and the scar on my neck never disappeared. Don't know what was released in that explosion, but I'm sure it's still there feeding. Sometimes when I'm alone, I feel that weight in the air again, and the dread comes back, as if something invisible is still watching me. The invisible scars. I was born in 1992 in a small village in the backwoods, not far from where they say that such an explosion happened decades before. I grew up hearing vague stories about that event, but to be honest, nobody liked talking about it. It was like a forbidden subject, a secret that everyone knew but preferred to ignore. My mother always said, "Be careful with the land, it has memory." I thought it was just something older people, superstitions. Until at 10 years old, I began to realize that my life and the children around me were not exactly normal. Many of my friends suffered from strange health problems, ranging from severe allergies to motor and cognitive difficulties that no one could explain. At the time, my family and others said it was God's thing, but I began to suspect that there was something else. My first big scare came when my younger sister, Anna, who was only 6 years old, began to develop dark spots on her skin out of nowhere. They appeared and disappeared as if they were bruises, but there was no pain or apparent cause. They took her to doctors in several nearby towns, but no one could give an explanation. "It's something environmental," one of them said, but the conversation always stopped there. The doctors seemed uncomfortable, and my mother said it was no use to insist. A few years later, I heard the adults talking about something that struck me. They said that scientists had visited the region when I was a baby, taking soil samples and even blood samples from children, but never released the results. People said it was dangerous, that messing with these things only attracted more trouble. When I was 14, I began to realize that the situation was even stranger than I imagined. One of the girls in the village, Luisa, who was my age, began to have frequent fainting spells. She said that before she erased it, I felt like something was crawling inside her. It wasn't just psychological, I saw it happen. Once during class, she collapsed on the floor and stood there shaking, while everyone watched without knowing what to do. Her face was pale, but what scared me most was the look on her face when she woke up. It was as if she had seen something no one else could see. When we asked, all she said was, "They didn't leave." That stuck in my head for days. Who were they? Was it just something she invented because of fear, or had more behind? In the same year, my father began having recurring nightmares. He never talked much, but once I heard him whispering with my mother in the kitchen that the dreams were always the same. He was in the field, surrounded by a fog, and heard voices whispering things he did not understand. "It seems like they're angry," he said. My mother just told him to pray and forget about it. But it wasn't just him. Other residents began to report similar things. Even people who had never left the village were having the same kind of dream. By then, I was already convinced that there was something wrong with the land, with the air, with everything around us. It wasn't a coincidence. And the strangest thing is that the closer we got to the places where they say the explosion happened, the more intense was this feeling that something was wrong. Time passed, but the stories never completely disappeared. When I was 18, I started working in a local pharmacy, and it was there that I began to understand the pattern. Most children born in the village had some kind of health problem, from severe allergies to learning difficulties that seemed to make no sense. The mothers came to get medicine constantly, and I often heard whispers between them that something in their blood was not normal. It was also at this time that I learned of a study that had been done in secret. One of the teachers of the school told me, quietly, that scientists from outside had analyzed the soil and blood of people in the village and found traces of something that should not be there. He couldn't explain it right, but he seemed very nervous talking about it. The next week, he asked for a transfer and left. What made me most afraid was what happened shortly after. A group of foreign researchers appeared in the village, bringing equipment that I had never seen before. They stayed a few days, digging and collecting samples, but left without giving any explanation. My father said it was better that way, that these things only bring problems. But soon after their departure, several people began to get sick. Some had high fevers, others developed strange sores on the skin. Even the animals seemed affected. Our neighbor's dog, which was always healthy, started losing hair and having seizures. That's when I started to believe in what the most old people always say: the earth is cursed, and anyone who messes with it pays the price. Things started getting even stranger after that. I remember one night, months after the researchers' visit, was at home with my parents when a strong wind began, the kind that we rarely see in the region. The air was heavy, with a strange smell of sulfur, and could feel the discomfort in the skin, as if small shocks passed through the whole body. It was that night that our neighbor, Mr. Alfredo, knocked at our door, completely pale. He said that he was hearing voices coming from the land in the back of the yard. My mother tried to calm him down, but he insisted that the voices whispered his name repeatedly. My father, always skeptical, went there to prove that he had nothing. He came back saying he did not see or heard anything, but never mentioned the episode again. After that, Mr. Alfredo fell ill quickly. In a matter of weeks, he lost weight, and his skin became full of dark spots, as if it was rotting. Some people in the village said he moved where he shouldn't, but I knew that he was just another victim of what surrounded us. The government had already sent teams to reassure the residents, saying that there was nothing wrong and that the diseases were the result of poor nutrition or hygiene. But no one believed them. The feeling was that we were all stuck there, being watched by something that nobody could see but was always present. And the worst, it seemed that the longer someone stayed in the village, the more intense the symptoms were, as if the place was slowly consuming us. One of the most frightening moments happened a few years later, when my sister Anna, now in her 20s, had a crisis during the early hours. She woke up screaming, saying that she could not breathe. When I ran into her room, I saw that her skin was covered by small bubbles, almost invisible, but which seemed to shine in the dim light of the lamp. Her gaze was of pure terror, and she kept repeating, "They are here, they never left." My mother cried, trying to calm her down, but the feeling I had was that it wasn't just panic that was affecting her. The air in the room was different, heavier, almost impossible to breathe. We put Anna in the car and took her to the hospital in the neighboring city, but the doctors could not explain what was happening. They just gave us a serum and asked us to come home. After that, my family began to seriously consider leaving the village. But getting out was not so simple. The little we had was there. The house, the land that, although it seemed cursed, still gave us sustenance. And there was also the fear that, even leaving, something would follow us. Many people who tried to leave reported strange sensations, even far from the village. It was as if something had entered them, something that could not be left behind. Some families sold everything and disappeared without telling anyone, but we never knew what happened to them. The question remained, did they finally get rid of it or just disappeared, like so many other unexplainable things around here? As much as we tried to move on with our lives, the feeling that something was wrong never left us. Every year, it seemed that the village became quieter, as if the environment itself was losing life. People stopped leaving their homes at night, and no one spoke more openly about health problems or strange dreams. It was as if silence was the only way to survive. The government never returned, and the researchers disappeared as quickly as they arrived. We were left with the invisible scars, both in the body and mind, and the certainty that we were on our own. The last time I heard about investigations in the area was when a journalist tried to reopen the case. He stayed in the village for 2 days and was found dead on the 3rd in a hotel room in the neighboring town. Cause? Heart attack. But no one believed. Today I live far from the village, but I never managed to get rid of the memories. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night with the same feeling of heaviness in my chest, as if something was watching me. I look in the mirror and still see small spots on my skin that come and go, without explanation. I have been to doctors, I did tests, but never found anything. My sister moved away, but recently called me saying she had a strange dream. In the dream, she was back in the village, and a voice whispered, "You can never escape." I don't know what really happened in that explosion, nor what was released on the earth, but I know it is still there waiting. And somehow it's in us too. The dark testimony of Father Richard. I was a young seminarian when I first heard of Father Richard and his work in Magdalene. I grew up in a deeply religious community where priests were almost untouchable figures, beacons of morality and wisdom. Heard stories about Richard as someone who had challenged his own hell to protect his flock, but the details always came wrapped in whispers and nervous looks. When I finally read about him in the old church archives years later, the narrative was completely different. The official report said that he was a dedicated priest who tragically disappeared after a fire in his church. But it was the diary I found, hidden in the old sacristy of a nearby parish, that changed everything. The leather cover was scorched, and the pages were impregnated with a frenetic writing, as if they had been scribbled in haste. The phrase, "They are here," was repeated on almost every page. I decided to investigate further what happened in Magdalene, and that's when the most frightening reports started to come up. The few people who were willing to talk said that the deaths in the village were unlike anything they had ever seen. The victims disappeared without leaving a trace, and when they were found, that's when they had strange marks on their bodies, like cuts or symbols that nobody could identify. The detail that bothered me most was about the eyes. According to the residents, they were open but completely erased, as if something had sucked up all their lives. Father Richard, initially skeptical, began to believe that something profoundly evil was going on when, during a nighttime mass, he heard whispers that seemed to echo among the empty benches of the church. The first entries in Father Richard's diary show a tormented man, but determined to find answers. He reported hearing voices during his prayers, initially as a distant murmur, something he believed to be the result of tiredness or loneliness. But as the days went by, the whispers became clearer, and he began to realize that they were not just random words. The voices laughed, mocked, and mentioned names of people who would disappear shortly after. Richard described in detail how these voices seemed to know the innermost sins of each resident, secrets that no one should know. He tried to exorcise the place, perform purification rituals in the church and houses of the village, but everything seemed in vain. The more I tried to drive it out, the more intense the torment. One of the most terrifying stories he told involved a young man named Thomas, who was a church sacristan. According to the diary, Tomas disappeared after a particularly disturbing event. During a mass, while Richard was doing the consecration, Thomas began to shake violently and fell to the ground with glazed eyes, as if he were seeing something that no one else could see. He babbled incomprehensible words before getting up, pointing to the altar and shouting, "They are here!" That night, Thomas disappeared. He was found 2 days later in the bottom of an abandoned well, with the same strange marks that other victims had. Richard wrote that, upon seeing the body, he felt a chill that seemed to come from within his own soul, as if something was there watching. After the death of Thomas, Father Richard became completely obsessed with understanding what was happening. He prayed for hours, often alone in the church, seeking answers. It was during one of those nights that he described one of the most frightening events in the diary. While praying the rosary, he felt a growing heat in the room, as if the air was being consumed. The candles began to blow out one by one, but he did not see anyone. Then he heard the voices again, but this time they were closer, clearer, and more distinct. They laughed and whispered, accusing him of being impotent against what they called the inevitable. The priest reported feeling a presence behind him, but when he turned around there was nothing, only the sensation that something had been there, close enough to touch his shoulder. The next morning, Richard found marks on the altar that were not there before. They were symbols engraved on wood, which he described as resembling ancient letters or runes. He tried to remove them, but the wood seemed untouched, as if it was protected by something. He asked other priests for help, but no one wanted to get involved. Some said it was the devil's work, while others simply refused to believe. It was then that Richard decided to try and alert the Vatican. He wrote a detailed letter describing everything that had happened and sent it through a reliable messenger. However, a few days later the church was consumed by a mysterious fire. The flames came during the early morning, and according to the residents, there was no sign of smoke before. The building was completely destroyed, and the priest disappeared without a trace. After the fire, the disappearance of Father Richard left the village in a state of silent panic. No one talked about what happened, but everyone knew something was wrong. The villagers avoided passing near the ruins of the church, saying that even after the flames had died out, the place still seemed alive. Some people swear to hear murmurs at night from the ashes, while others report seeing shadows moving through the wreckage. A man, brave or desperate enough, tried to search the place for something that could explain the fire. He found a single object intact, the priest's diary. The pages were burned at the edges, but much of the content remained legible. He was the one who gave me the diary years later, when I went through the village in search of information about the case. What disturbed me most in reading the diary was the growing despair in Father Richard's words. He clearly knew that something far beyond his comprehension was happening. In the last full entry, he wrote that the voices became incessant, bolder, saying things about the villagers, revealing sins and secrets he should never know. He mentioned that he began to see figures in the corners of the room at night, shapes that seemed made of pure darkness, immobile but clearly observing. At the end of that entry he wrote, "They don't choose by chance. Each death is a sentence, and the village is just the beginning." The rest of the diary was a frantic repetition of the phrase, "They are here," as if he was trying to warn the world of something that could not be explained. After reading the diary, I started to piece together what could have happened. The village of Magdalene is not the same since the disappearance of Father Richard. The people who remain there live in an oppressive silence, as if any wrong word could bring back what the priest so feared. I tried to talk with the older residents, but almost all avoid the subject. A gentleman told me, almost inaudible, that they were still there, but that they learned to remain silent in order to survive. The only thing he asked was that I leave the diary with him. "This shouldn't be with you," he said, eyes filled with something between fear and pity. I gave it, and he burned the diary in front of me, as if destroying it was the only way to contain whatever was in it. To this day, the case of Father Richard is an unsolved mystery. Some nights, especially in moments of deep silence, I can still hear his words echoing in my mind. "They are here." I don't know if it's my mind playing tricks, or if something really was marked in me after visiting that place. What I know is that I never went back to Madalena, nor do I plan to go back. Something is there beyond human understanding, something that consumed the priest and left a mark on those who dared to cross his way. Whenever I remember this story, I get the feeling that his phrase was not only a warning to the village, but to all of us. The missing film crew. I remember exactly the day I first heard about the missing film crew in 2003. I was a teenager and lived in a village near the place where it all happened. The hinterland was a quiet place, but full of stories that left us with a foot behind. At the time, the rumors of radiation were a laughingstock for many, but not for the elders, who said that the earth had been touched by something it should not have. When those documentary filmmakers appeared, armed with cameras and equipment that no one in the village had seen before, many people were disturbed. Not for what they were doing, but for what they might end up awakening. My mother, always superstitious, repeated, "There is something that is better left quiet." The team was made up of 4 people, and they arrived with a van full of equipment. The leader, a man named Jonas, seemed to be the most charismatic, always trying to convince the villagers to speak to the camera. He said it was an important project, something that would show the world what was happening there. Most people refused, but some, like old Zika, gave in more out of curiosity than anything else. I watched from afar as they assembled their things in the middle of the dry field, near an area that everyone avoided. It felt strange. There was something in the air, something that made my skin crawl even under the scorching sun. And it was on that first night that things started to get out of hand. That night, the team set up camp near a region known as the Stone of Silence. It was a rock formation that the residents avoided at all costs, saying that there the wind does not speak. Can't explain what that means, but whenever we passed by, even the birds seemed to disappear. The crew, of course, ignored the warnings and spent hours recording. After the sunset, strange noises began to appear from the forest. I was at home, but could hear the wind carrying the sounds to the village. It wasn't the kind of sound you expect from the backcountry at night. There were no crickets, no noise of animals. It was something deeper, as if the earth itself was groaning. Some people in the village commented on this the next day. but no one wanted to go there and check it out. The next morning, one of the residents who worked as a guide returned alone, visibly shaken. He said that Jonas, the team leader, had disappeared during the night. He said that he was helping to carry equipment when he heard Jonas screaming in the middle of the woods. Ran there, but all he found were his boots, lined up on the ground, as if he had quietly pulled them out before disappearing. The guide insisted that the rest of the team leave, but they refused. "It's just tiredness. He must have gone for a drive and got lost," they said. But the guide didn't want to take any chances. He returned alone to the village and swore never to step foot in that area again. The team continued with the recordings, and that's when things started to get even more disturbing. After the guide returned to the village, the mood became even more heavy. I remember hearing my father and other residents discussing Jonas' disappearance and how the film crew should have left. But instead they stayed. On the second day, rumors began to circulate that they had found something near the Stone of Silence. One of the staff's helpers was seen carrying boxes with something that looked like sensitive equipment, and another resident commented that he heard one of them saying, "Readings are out of the ordinary." No one knew exactly what it meant, but the fact is that that night a strange wind began to blow. It was not a wind. It came in gusts, as if it were circling around the village. The noise was almost mesmerizing, but carried a disturbing tone, like a lament. It was that same night that the most disturbing footage was recorded, at least according to what came out later. When the team disappeared completely, authorities found the abandoned tapes in the middle of the camp, still inside one of the cameras. The footage showed strange figures, something that hardly looked human, but it was not animal. They were motion blurs, as if the camera could not focus on them, but it was possible to distinguish tall and slender shapes, which seemed to move slowly around the stone. The most terrifying were the captured sounds. The tapes contained distant whispers and laughter, mixed with screams that later the villagers identified as being from Jonah. The idea that he was still alive, but somehow attached to it, was enough for everyone in the village to begin avoiding the place altogether. On the third day, the entire team disappeared. When the villagers realized they had not returned, a small group decided to go to the camp. The scenario they found was like something out of a nightmare. The van was there, with the doors wide open, and the equipment scattered on the floor, as if someone had left in a hurry. There were marks on the ground, deep scratches that looked like claws, but there was no sign of struggle or blood. The tapes left at the camp were the only clues to what might have happened, but no one in the village had the courage to watch them until the end. Those who tried said that, in addition to the whispers and laughter, there were moments when the image was static, and it was possible to see distorted faces appearing on the screen, as if they were stuck between frames. After the tapes were taken by the authorities, reports of strange presences began. The residents who participated in the search began to report that at night they felt as if something was watching their homes. Others heard whispers coming from nowhere and footsteps in the yard. Even those who never approached the place began to report feelings of oppression, as if the air had become denser. The invisible presence seemed to have spread, affecting the entire village. The authorities, as always, said that it was an accident and that the team probably got lost in the backwoods, but no one believed it. Who lives here knows that the hinterland keeps its secrets, and that place, in particular, should have been left alone. Operation Argus, the evil that comes from heaven. I grew up hearing stories about Operation Argus, but no one in my family talked about it openly. It was always in suggestions, as if only to mention the name that could bring something bad. When I was a child, the elders said that the sky had broken on a night in 1958, and that this flash was not God's doing. My grandparents, who lived in the Backlands at the time, said that after that night, things were never the same. People began to disappear, animals became restless, and the silence of the nights ceased to be quiet and became oppressive. In my teens, I was quite curious to research the operation and found that it had been presented as a military experiment by the Americans, but the locals had another version. They said something was bought from heaven and should not be here. Once I heard my grandmother tell the story of a man named Vicente who worked as a cowboy. She said he was one of the first people to go after the flash. Vincent was known to be strong and brave, the kind who wasn't impressed by haunting stories. But a few weeks after the event, he started acting strange, saying that he heard things when he was alone in the field. He spoke of children's invisible steps, muffled laughter, and a feeling that was being watched. One night, while returning to work, Vicente simply disappeared. All he found was his hat and a knife, left on the ground near a dry stream. My grandmother always said that Vicente was taken, and every time someone asked what it did, she just changed the subject, her eyes filled with fear. As the years passed, disappearances decreased, and residents began to avoid going out at night. They said that the dark was not safe, that there was something out there that we could not see but felt, who was alone for a long time or walked to places farther back different when he came back. A friend of my family, Joaquin, went through something that even today I can't forget. He worked with deliveries and on one of these night trips had to cross a road near where the flash was most visible. When I returned to the village, he was pale with a lost look. He could barely speak, but it is relevant, something that froze me to the bones. Joaquim said he saw figures on the roadside, but when he arrived directly, they disappeared like smoke. After that night, Joaquim was never the same. He began to isolate himself, saying that he heard voices when he was alone, especially at night. People began to notice strange marks on his arms, like the losses they made from the inside out, but he never explained what had been achieved. A few weeks later, he disappeared. He was found days later in a cave near the village, sitting against the wall with open eyes but lifeless. There was something on the walls of that cave I could never forget, marks, symbols that were scratched in the stone. They said that they were signs left by them, but no one knew who or what they were. After that, the locals began to believe that the sky had not only brought light that night, but something much darker. The reports of shady figures began to spread throughout the region, and people became increasingly frightened. My uncle, who was known to be a practical and skeptical man, had an experience that completely changed the way he saw the world. He said that he did not believe in haunted stories and that people's fear was just superstition. Until one night, while returning to the neighboring city, he saw something on the road. He spoke as a tall shadow, darker than the night around, which seemed to float. It had no face, no definite shape, but there was something undeniably human in its posture. My uncle said he sped up the bike, but the engine died suddenly, and all he could do was watch as the shadow slowly moved in his direction. When he got home, he suffered a shock. He was shaking and had trouble breathing. For days, he was shut up, saying that he could not sleep because he felt they were watching him. My father tried to convince him that it was just fear of talking, but he insisted that it wasn't imagination. A few weeks later, I found my uncle sitting in the yard, staring at the sky. He didn't say a word, but his eyes were different, almost like those of Joaquin before he died. After that day, he lost the will to live, stopping eating and completely isolating himself until his death months later. My mother said that whatever came with the flash not only took people, but drained something from them, as it feeds on the fear and sanity of those who remained. Over time, the situation in the region became unbearable. Some families decided to leave everything and move away, but not all had the courage or conditions to leave, who began to create their own rules of survival. No one left at night, windows and doors were locked at sunset, and people avoided talking about the disappearances, believing that silence could survive them. The feeling of being lent became constant. It was as if something was lurking, waiting for someone to lower their guard. Once, during a party in the village, I heard an older man comment that the flash opened a door that should never have been touched. He was quickly silenced by other residents, but those words were etched in my mind. Something about the way he spoke seemed more a warning than a superstition. The authorities, of course, never assumed anything. They said that the deaths and disappearances were accidents or isolated cases, but no one believed it. From time to time, researchers would show up in the area, but never stay for long. Whenever we are nervous, as if they know more than they were willing to reveal. I remember one time when one of these researchers came to the village and brought equipment to measure something in the area. He did not explain what he was doing, but commented in a moment of discovery that the readings were anomalous. The next day he left without a word and never came back. It was as if they knew something there should not be disturbed. The residents even avoided mentioning the flash or disappearances. Silence was the only way to deal with the terror. Even as the years passed, the fear never completely disappeared. The village became a place where time seemed to stand still, as if people were just waiting for something worse to happen. Sometimes stories of people swearing they saw shadowy figures on roadsides or in plantations at night would come up. Those who still lived there said that these appearances were a reminder that they had never really gone away. I remember one particular night, years later, when I visited the region. I was staying at a family friend's house, and during the early morning hours, I woke up with a suffocating feeling. It was as if the room was full of something invisible. When I looked out the window, I swear I saw a shadow move towards the house. I was paralyzed, unable to blink. When the sun rose, the feeling disappeared, but that night never left my head. Today, people have avoided talking about Operation Argus or what happened back then. Most prefer to believe that it was just a military experiment that went wrong, but those who lived it know that it was much more. Whatever has been brought by the flash is still there, hidden in the shadows, feeding on the fear and sanity of those who dare to cross your path. I never spoke again, but now and then, in moments of absolute silence, I feel that same oppression in the air, as if something was watching me from afar. Whatever came from heaven that night is still waiting, and I can only hope no one else will be foolish enough to try to open that door again. The hidden costs of Cold War experiments. I grew up hearing stories about the mysterious ships that appeared on the northeast coast in the 1950s and 60s. My grandfather, who was a fisherman, always talked about those boats that came out of nowhere and disappeared before dawn. He said they were not like the boats we saw in the area. They were much larger, almost without lighting, and operated in complete silence. When I was a child, I found that this was just another of the many legends of the hinterland and the coast. But as I grew up, I began to notice that older people avoided talking too much about it. They said that messing with the past brings bad things. Still, some nights my grandfather let slip a comment or another. Like one time they observed the dead fish floating in the mounds after these ships passed. The stories became more sinister when I found out that my mother also had memories of this period. She, still a child at the time, lived in a coastal village where farmers picked the note that the soil seemed burned in some places. The crops simply did not grow, and the few vegetables they could harvest tasted bitter, almost metallic. The animals also started acting strange. Dogs and cats disappeared or were aggressive without reason, and cattle appeared dead in places where no predator could have reached. My mother always mentioned a particular night when the villagers saw a flash in the sky, something so strong that lit up the entire village as if it were day. The next day, several people suddenly fell ill. High fevers, vomiting, and in some cases red spots on the skin. That's when the village priest started to say that it was punishment of God, but no one believed it. The reports about the flash in the sky and the ships were not exclusive to the mother's village. When I started talking to other people in the area, I realized that similar stories were coming from elsewhere. Some fishermen said that during the early morning they saw lights in the sea which were always underwater, as if something was operating in the depths. Others speak of a buzzing, a deep and continuous sound that made the air vibrate. My grandfather reported that once, while fishing at night, he saw something that looked like a giant antenna coming out of the water, but before he could approach, he was hit by a headache so strong that he could barely get home. He was 2 days in bed, with fever and tremors, and always said that that was not the work of humans. Decades later, health problems began to appear more frequently among residents. What struck me most was how these diseases concentrated in families who lived closer to the areas where ships were seen or where flashes of light illuminated the sky. My aunt developed a rare blood disease that the doctors of the capital could not explain. Symptoms include extreme tiredness, dark spots on the skin, and eventually a generalized weakness that has left her confined to bed. Around the same time, a group of researchers appeared in the region, saying they wanted to study the environmental effects caused by agricultural practices. But everyone knew that this was just an excuse. They collected soil, water, and even blood samples from some residents, but never released the results. When we asked, they said only that there was no reason for concern. The researchers' investigations aroused more fear than the breakup among residents. They came at night, using equipment that no one understood, and always avoided giving explanations. Sometimes I have heard reports from farmers who said they saw these men burying something in the farthest lands where no one used to go. My father, who worked on one of those farms, came home once and said he had found small metal barrels partially buried with strange symbols painted on them. He could not say what it was, but the smell around him was suffocating, like sulfur mixed with something chemical. Days later, my father began to have sores on the skin, especially on the hands. He said they were work bruises, but my mother believed it was something much worse, related to things he saw. One of the most disturbing memories for me happened when I was about 12 years old. Went to play with friends near a river that cut the village, but when we got there, we found dead fish floating in the water. There was a strange glow on the surface, like oil mixed with light, and a smell so strong that it seemed to burn my nose. My mother was furious when she heard I had gone there. "This water is no longer ours," she said, as I rubbed with soap until my skin turned red. That very night, I began to feel an experience in my hands that quickly turned into small and painful bubbles. My mother insisted it was just an allergy, but I knew it was something else. For weeks, my skin peeled off, and the marks never completely disappeared. It was at this time that I began to realize that the harmless experiments left a mark that no one could ignore. In the years that have passed, the stories never completely disappeared. In fact, it seems they only got more sinister. When I was a teenager, I started to hear about people who lived closer to the affected areas, and I got to show strange behaviors. A neighbor of ours, known as Zé do Rancho, was a quiet man until the outbreaks began. He said that he heard voices calling for him at night, whispers coming from the field where he planted cassava. At first, everyone realized that it was his head, but after the oxen suddenly fell down with their eyes glazed and foam in their mouth, no one doubted anymore. Zay said that the animals were seeing things, and that he felt the same presence when he passed near the stream that cut the property. One night he disappeared. All he found was his hat, hanging on a tree branch. This story has been repeated in other families. People came to avoid the fields at night, and the boat from which the land was poisoned was delivered. What bothered me most was how the disappearances and obvious diseases followed a pattern. It was not random. Whoever became sick or disappeared seemed to be always connected to somewhere where those ships or lights had been seen. A cousin of mine, who worked as a guide for some researchers, told me that they once took samples from a cave near the beach. He said their equipment was whistling and whistling inside the cave, as if there were something very radioactive there. But what scared him the most was the smell. It seemed like the place was dead inside, he said. Soon after that, he began to present the same strange symptoms: spots on his skin, tiredness, and a dry cough that was never. Things got even more complicated when reports surfaced that the government had cut off any kind of funding for studies in the area. The few researchers that still appeared in the region literally disappeared. A group that came to investigate the soil conditions abandoned the project without explanation after only 1 week. Their leader, a man named Dr. Renato, was last seen entering an isolated area with 2 colleagues. When the villagers were left behind, all that returned was their car, with the headlights still on but no one inside. This was a drop of water for many families who left the village en masse. My parents decided to stay, but fear became part of everyday life. There was always that feeling that something was wrong, that we were living on a land that hid dangerous secrets. Today, I live far from that village, but the marks of that past have never completely abandoned me. I have scars on my hands that doctors can't explain, and sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night with the same strange occurrence that I felt when I was a child. I have tried to find out more about the experiments, but it seems that everything has been buried, both literally and metaphorically. Some nights, especially in moments of absolute silence, I can still hear the buzzing sounds my grandfather mentioned, as if something was around. Perhaps they are only memories, or maybe they are remnants of what was left behind. The only thing I know is that what happened there was not harmless, and somehow I feel that it is still waiting, perhaps for the next person too curious to leave the past alone. A forgotten epidemic. I grew up listening to my grandmother talk about the flash in the sky. She said it was something that no one could explain, but everything changed in the village where we lived. She was only 15 at the time and told that night, the sky became so bright that it looked like day, but with a strange color, a pale orange mixed with a white that hurt the eyes. The people went out of their houses to look without understanding what was happening and stood still, watching, until a loud sound, almost like prolonged thunder, took over the air. After that, she said the silence that came next was the scariest. It was not just the absence of noise. It was as if the world had stopped breathing for a few seconds. The flash disappeared as fast as it appeared, but the consequences remained forever. My grandmother always said that it was that night that everything started to go wrong. First, the animals. Cows, goats, chickens. They all started dying for no apparent reason. My grandfather, who was a farmer, said the land had changed. The crops did not grow as before, and the little we could harvest had a bitter taste, almost metallic. Then came the people. My mother was born healthy, but her two brothers died before they turned a year old, victims of diseases that the doctors could not explain. In the next generation, things got even stranger. My cousins were born with slight deformities, like extra fingers or eyes that did not line up right. When she asked my grandmother what she found out had caused all this, she only murmured, "It was the flash. He brought a curse." As the years went by, I began to realize that what my grandmother said was not just a superstition. Many families in our village lived similar situations. Young adults had to struggle to have children, and those who did had healthy babies. What scared me the most was how these obvious things are so isolated from the rest of the world. The doctors who visited the village reported that they gave clear explanations, and when the tests were done, the results were accompanied by serious looks and evasive answers. I remember once taking my cousin to a hospital in a nearby town. She had a persistent cough that didn't get better with any medicine. The doctors did blood tests and x-rays, but all they said was that it didn't look like anything ordinary. When we asked more, they changed the subject because they did not want to compromise. The thing got even stranger when we started talking about radiation. I was 17 when a group of scientists appeared in the village, saying they would like to study the environmental effects in the region. They brought equipment that no one understood and took samples of everything: soil, water, even hair and blood of some residents. I was one of the volunteers, but after the samples were sent for analysis, we never heard from them again. It was only years later, when I was an adult, that I found an article on the internet about genetic damage that was consistent with radiation exposure. The transfers matched exactly the symptoms we saw in the village: rare cancers, congenital deformities, and infertility. It gave me a shiver, but also a feeling of impotence. If it was really radiation, why did no one talk about it officially? After reading that article, I started to connect the dots and look for more information. I talked to older residents, trying to understand if anyone knew anything concrete, but all I got were fragmented stories. Once, a gentleman named John, who was known to be the most suspicious of the village, told me something he never forgot. He said that years after the flare, he saw men in strange suits, looking like astronaut clothes, confused on the ground near the old plantation. They carried machines that made low noises, almost like buzzing. John tried to approach to ask what it was, but he was expelled by two armed men who said they were there for the safety of all. He swore that he saw them burying something before they left. When I tell it, he seemed scared, as if the simple act of remembering was dangerous. Things got worse in the village as the years went by. Cancers became common, affecting entire families. My own father was revealed with a rare type in his stomach and died a few months later. The strangest thing was that many cases arose between people who lived close to each other, as if there was a connection between where they lived and the diseases they had. The village was known as cursed by residents of neighboring towns. They avoided doing business with people or even passing through the area. Once, I heard a trader at the fair saying that the village was marked land of people. It stuck in my head because that's exactly how I felt, as if they carried an invisible mark that condemned us. From the moment I realized something was wrong, I started to question why nobody did anything. I went after official records, trying to find any evidence that the diseases and deformities in the village were being investigated, but it seemed our existence had been erased from the maps. There were no studies, statistics, or any mention of the village in public health reports. This made me angry, but also helpless. Who would care about a secluded village in the backlands? It was then that I decided to talk with a biology professor from a university in the neighboring city. He said that he had heard rumors of radiation contamination in the area, but that everything seemed to be surrounded by secrecy. According to him, the genetic damage they saw in people was consistent with prolonged nutrients at low levels of radiation, but when he went deeper into his research, it lost funding and was based on the abandonment of the project. The people in the village began to accept that they were alone. Some tried to move, but it was hard to find who wanted to buy the land or houses. Who stayed, like my family, did everything possible to survive. I remember once when my mother showed me an old map of the region. She pointed to a secluded area near the river and said, "This is where it all began." She didn't explain anything else, but the expression on her face was enough to make me understand that I shouldn't go there. Of course, like all curious young men, I ignored the warning. I took my bike and went to the place. The air there was different, denser, almost suffocating. There was a clearing surrounded by dead trees, and in the middle of it, a depression in the ground. It seemed that something had been buried there. I never told my mother, but left that place with a feeling that was never distant. Something in that land was wrong. After my clear visit, I started having recurring nightmares. I dreamed of the light my grandmother described, but in my dream it seemed to be right above me, illuminating everything around me. Deep in the dream, I heard voices whispering, as if they were trying to tell me something that I could not understand. Woke up sweating cold, and with a feeling that something was watching me. I don't know if it was a coincidence or if there really was something wrong with me, but a few months later I started having health problems that I had never had before. My skin became sensitive, and small sores began to appear on my arms and legs, as if something was corroding inside. The doctors found no explanation, but the spots never disappeared completely. Today, I live far from that village, but the memories never left me. Every time I think back to those years, I get the feeling that we left to die. The people of the village were seen as simple, as part of an experiment that no one wants to admit. The earth still bears the marks, and the few who remained living in silence, as if ignoring the truth was the only way to survive. I am still afraid to talk about it openly, because I feel there are greater forces that do not want this story told. But every time I look at the scars on my body or think of children who will never have a chance to grow up healthy, I know I can't forget. Something happened there, something that will never be revealed, but which continues to haunt us even today. The dimensional collapse. I never thought that I would believe in something that could not be explained, but what happened that night changed everything. I grew up in a small village in the backlands, where stories of hauntings and legends have always been part of everyday life. My father used to laugh at them, saying it was a thing for people with too much imagination. But after the flash, he started acting differently. The explosion happened when I was 14 years old. The sky is lit with such intense brightness that it seemed as if the sun had exploded during the night. It was something so unnatural that you could feel in the skin, like a heat that did not come from the air, but from inside the body. After that, a strange feeling began, as if something was wrong with the environment around us. The wind stopped, the sound of crickets and other insects disappeared, and the darkness returned denser than ever. The next morning, normal things, but soon began the boats. People said they heard strange sounds in the night sky, such as distant hints or continuous buzzing. Some reported feeling that they were being watched, even though they were alone. I didn't pay much attention at first, until things happened in my own home. My younger sister, who was always cheerful and talkative, began to change. She said that she heard someone calling for her outside the room at night, a low and gentle voice, but it scared her. My father, who was always a calm man, started having anger attacks out of nowhere. I remember once he corded the kitchen table with one stroke, something I've never seen him do before. It was as if something had infiltrated his mind, and the feeling was that we were not alone. Things got worse when the strange behavior was no longer limited to my family. A neighbor, Alvaro, known for being a quiet and hard-working man, disappeared during the night. They found him 2 days later, sitting in the middle of the field, with his eyes wide and not blinking, as if he had seen something that no one else could see. He did not say anything, only murmured something that no one could understand. Then he began to laugh alone, a laugh that did not seem human, and was taken to the big city, where he said he'd lost his head. But in the village, everyone knew it was easier to do. The feeling that something was infiltrating people's minds became stronger. The nights became unbearable. I myself began to hear sounds in the room, like footsteps dragged across the floor. But every time he turned on the light, there was nothing there. One particular night was when everything really fell apart. I woke up in the middle of the morning with a horrible feeling, as if something was leaning against me. The room was so dark I couldn't see anything, but I knew I wasn't alone. I was paralyzed, trying to control my breath, when I heard a low voice, almost like a suggestion in my ear. It was not a language I understood, but the intonation was clear, anger mixed with something that seemed fun. My first occurrence was when I shrunk in the bed and closed my eyes, but when I opened it again, I saw something moving in the corner of the room. It was not exactly a shape, but a kind of shadow darker than the environment, which seemed to pulsate. Before I could scream, she disappeared, silence returned, but the room was cold, as if all energy had been drained. After that night, I could not sleep properly. I started to leave the lights on and to lock the door of the room, but it did not help much. The worst was that I couldn't talk about what I saw. Every time I tried to tell my mom or dad, it felt like something was blocking me, as if it wasn't safe to mention it out loud. In the village, things got out of control. A woman, Dona Raquel, broke into her husband with a knife after saying that he was no longer himself. She swore that she saw something in his eyes, something that did not belong to this world. After that, the two left, but no one knew what happened to them. Other people began to report similar things, voices during the night, shadows moving on the edges of the vision, and a feeling that something was inside them, controlling their thoughts. That's when I started to realize that the events were not random. The closer one was to areas where the flash was most visible, the more intense the symptoms were. Some people began to hear voices that not only whispered, but also told things to be done. A friend of mine, Anna, confessed that her voice told her to hurt her younger brother. She cried as she told me that, saying that she didn't want to do anything, but it was like it wasn't her will. A few days later, Anna disappeared. When they went to look for her, I found only a scribbled message on the wall of her room, made with charcoal. I cannot resist. From then on, the whole village went into panic. People locked their doors and avoided looking at the sky, as if something up there was present in everything. Fear took hold of the village, and each day seemed worse than the previous. People stopped leaving their homes, especially at night. There was something in the air, a constant sense that we were being watched. The sunlight, which was always intense in the backlands, seemed weaker, as if something was interfering with it. The climax happened when a group of residents decided to organize a vigil to pray, believing that faith could save or whatever was haunting us. I went with my mother, but during the prayer I heard something that should not be there. A sound coming from the sky, which was like a hum mixed with words that no one understood. I looked at the faces of people around me, and I realized that some started crying, others were paralyzed, and one of them, Donna Marina, fell to the ground, shouting they were inside her. That night, no one slept. Donna Marina was taken home, but the next day her children found her sitting in the corner of the room with an empty smile on her face and repeating, "They are here. They are inside us." After that, more families left the village, leaving their homes and belongings behind. My mother insisted that we stay, but at this point even my father, who was always skeptical, began to believe that it was not something of this world. A month later, we moved to a distant city. Although we have never had more hope, what happened in that village has never left my mind. To this day, I have nightmares about the hum and voices. Sometimes I agree with the feeling that I'm still watching myself. Whatever came with the flash is still there. And worse, I think it will never go away.